I draw a blank. I thought you would start babbling after my question, so now I have to think about what my question was. Okay.
Oh, wait. So I'm the babbler and and you're the hard-hitting question guy?
Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast. In this show, we talk about our experiences and lessons learned in enterprise architecture and business process management. What's Your Baseline is designed to be for everyone. Newbies who are just getting started with these topics, organizations who want to improve their EA and BPM groups and the value they get from it, as well as practitioners who want to get a different perspective and care about the discipline.
Each episode will tackle different key topics, providing context, background, best practices, and stories from the road, inviting you to learn from our challenges and successes, and demonstrating key tools to help you set up your practice and get the most out of it.
I'm your host, Roland Wolt, and I'm joined today by my co-host, JM Erlinson. Hey, JM, how are you doing?
Hey, Roland. I'm doing all right. Living the dream, as we say.
As you should. That's the way how life should go. You know, you should not think about bad things, but live the dream and enjoy the day to your fullest.
Aw, thanks, man.
Like today, when we're going to talk about why architecture, why business process management. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation about when we look at where do those disciplines come from, when we look at how it's done today, and then when we look at, what are values of having those disciplines in an organization?
Yeah.
Maybe we get started with the first point. You know, I know you were very involved in process management in general. How would you describe process management as a discipline for somebody who hasn't heard about this?
Before we necessarily talk about the process management itself, we want to define the terms, right? So I feel like we've both heard a lot of people use, misuse, be confused by these acronyms: BPM, BPA, BPE. What are those? So let's start with the ones that are the easy ones. BPA, business process analysis, which is the practice of understanding and analyzing and improving the way in which you do processes, the way in which your organization runs business. BPE is the whole practice and organization around the optimization of it. So it's creating a scenario and a situation that allows people to work in this. And I know you've set up a ton of centers of excellence and process and engineering at organizations. But BPM, we see people talk about the big BPM and the small BPM and get them confused. Big BPM being business process management, thinking about automation, BPMS, like the automation of process steps and the integration thereof. And little BPM, or business process management or business process modeling, being the documentation thereof and the methodology and the creation of flow charts and the sharing and understanding in a visual sense of how companies work. What do you think about those things, Roland?
Yeah, I've seen that in a similar way, but also with a light twist in between, you know? So when I got started with that whole topic, which was back in the late 90s, it was only called BPM, business process management with a focus on the M. How do I manage my business processes? So the perspective coming from the discipline. When I look forward a couple of years in there, things changed. People were all eager about automation and all those wonderful things. Then the term BPM, even though the words were the same, switched. It became automation.
Yeah.
And then terms like BPA were invented, right, to make up the gap in between. To me, it always feels a little bit artificial. To me, it's all about, okay, is it the business architecture? What do we do from a business perspective as an organization? What requirements do we have to fulfill to be whatever, regulatory compliant and all these things? What requirements do we derive from a business perspective on systems implementation? So if today would somebody ask me about this, what BPM is, I would deflect more towards, actually it's business architecture, right? Because you're talking about the structures, it's the architecture part, the structures of how you do your business. And then as a follow-up, you have the methods and the means of doing this, having the tools, having the notations and whatnot, the bread and butter, the working material that you work with in making these things happen.
It is important to understand that the terminology is there to serve a purpose. It does communicate something. I mean, when I hear customers talk about BPM versus BPE, I know that they're thinking about it differently. BPM could be an automation exercise. It could be very much about the code and figuring out how to get those little blocks to work in the order you want so you can run an integrated analysis or whatever, or integrated system. Whereas when I hear people talk about BPE, I think, they might have a VP of process working in their organization. Somebody who is focused on the excellence around or the practice around making it better. And I feel like those organizations are much better set up for success. They're thinking about things at a level of abstraction beyond just what does a person do at a single point in time. They're thinking about what does our company do? What is our value chain? And I know that value chain analysis is really important. And I know you've done that for a lot of organizations. Where do you think about that starting, and how do you get that off the ground? Where does that fit into the realm of business process management and excellence?
Yeah, so obviously that's somewhat important, but let me take a step back. I think when you mentioned, there's a VP or a lead of a excellence group in there, I think this is a different topic, because that shows that this organization has understood that you have to have a certain maturity in how to manage your processes. And they've institutionalized by coming up with groups, by coming up with positions where people do this for a living.
Yeah.
In the more mature organizations. When you look at the history of process management, and maybe you can give us a 2-minute overview where it came from, the 4 different stages of process management. I think when you look at this, you will see that we are on a very clear trajectory, and value chain analysis is one part of that. But maybe, JM, maybe you can talk a little bit about the 4 phases of process management.
It's been a heck of a journey. I don't want to spend too much time giving you a history lesson, but generally it's accepted that there are sort of 4 different phases that process management has gone through. The first, there's sort of 3 waves of evolution, and sort of the foundations. So process management isn't a new discipline. In fact, you think about it coming from the industrial age in the 1700s, 1800s, and even early 1900s. We talk about the moving towards automated production, mechanized production in assembly lines. And so we wanted to understand the sequence of steps that were required for a mechanical task to be done. And when you're trying to build assembly lines, we take a look at process management done by manufacturing engineering. Although that discipline might not have been quite as well defined at that point in time, it was definitely manufacturing engineers that drove the conversation around that, and it was the first conversation around structured and ordered activity management. That took a change in the 70s and 80s. We think of it as sort of the first wave, or the first phase of the updated process management, process improvement, and that's where the terms like TQM, total quality management, came into play, where the first methodologies of documenting really came out and were popularized and accepted. And some of them are even still around. Like, I know the IDEF standard is still available at some organizations, and it's 40 years old. And that's when we started to take a look at statistical analysis, and being able to calculate the efficiency of processes, the cost of process, and be able to improve it. And that really took a turn in the 90s when we in a sort of our second wave of really process reengineering, process analysis. We started to get the Six Sigma, Lean Six Sigma, as a practice that was adopted, and our first generally available, consumer available, or at least corporate consumer available, computerized systems for process management, process improvement. In fact, the original creators of the product that I work very heavily on, Eris, IDS Shear, that's when that organization was spun up as a tool for consulting, a computerized tool for drawing out process. But it was still thinking of it as process as very physical. In some ways, physicality was represented almost by computer code, because that was what people were talking about. So what is a computer code and automation that we were doing as a result of this step? And that's where ERP analysis really became a hot topic, SAP focused, Oracle focused, of what were the automated steps in the order that they were happening. So even though it was a level of abstraction away from physicality and mechanized production, it was still thinking of them as one at a time and what you could see a person doing. Here's a transaction you have to run. And now I think of us in this really golden age, this sort of third wave of business process, and this is the business process management and excellence site where we're looking at process management as a layer of abstraction away from the physicality. We take a look at strategic process management, And Roland, you talk a lot about that when we take a look at process, value chains and how this synchronizes with organizations and KPIs, and you balance scorecards and fishbone diagrams and FMEAs and all these sorts of things that go along with strategic understandings, even using things like FMEAs that are tools that would come in from more of a mechanized and more of a mechanical and manufacturing engineering perspective, but also flipping it on its head and taking a look at customer journey management and customer perspectives on process. That layer of abstraction, I think, really empowers the new business process management to have a better, more comprehensive view of all the impacted parties and where the value can be extracted. And that's only since the mid 2000s we've really had a chance to do that with these modern tools built on collaboration, built on repositories, and ultimately built for end consumers, and for people at the desktop level, at the cloud level, to be able to access and interface with these processes as you go, both from a design and a consumption perspective.
Yeah, do you also notice this when you think about the technology side of things, which is interesting because things become more smaller, but they become bigger at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So when I think about API management and all those wonderful things where the whole technical architecture becomes way more smaller nuggets that have to be managed, you know, which then puts a real burden on the people managing these things because they have just a boatload of those, right? So it's a weird conundrum that we see here.
Well, it's not the way it works. The more you have access to, the more you have to manage, because now you have access to it. And that's where business process excellence and establishing those sort of centers of excellence and a common taxonomy and a common approach to how to manage and improve your processes chunks that down into bite-sized pieces, right? You have the division of labor that goes into managing this stuff. And I think in a subsequent episode, we're going to talk more about centers of excellence and how they get stood up and what people do in them. But just to know that the more you're thinking of that as a regimented process management methodology, the more you're going to be able to control that ballooning of information, the ballooning of responsibilities, and the impacts to the organization, the wide-reaching. But talking about impacts to organizations and how people do things, talk about enterprise architecture to me and as a practice and what you've seen it evolve as, because it's definitely a partner to this. And in fact, I think we're going to talk about it a little bit later, it may even be the same thing.
Yeah, so when you look at it, what people traditionally call as EA, and you might hear with my hesitancy that I'm not really a big fan of that categorization, but that's a different story that we will talk about in a minute. That discipline is obviously not that old, right? So it's like 30 years old. Think about Zachman coming up with his FAST framework, and I've seen him in which was fun, on one conference. Everybody had super ugly PowerPoint slides. He had an old-fashioned slide projector that he put on the stage, and was giving a lecture like he does in college, But yeah, that's somewhere out the 80s. And the funny thing is, it started on the technology side. When the digitization and the whole computer movement came up, people had a need to structure and organize that content, right? And it was literally the physical hardware that we try to manage. And then in a second wave, it moved on to applications, because that was then the soft stuff that run on the hard stuff, and they need to manage this. And as we all know, it goes in different waves. At the beginning, an organization is super lean, and then they grow and they acquire others. And at the end of the day, you have a whole mess of applications going on. And what I see now is more a third iteration of this, and some organizations try very hard to bring that thought in. When you think about the Open Group, for example, with the TOGAF framework, to say no, it's one thing. You need to bring in business architecture, and it's not only that IT exists because of IT reasons, which I'm pretty sure all IT folks can be very happy and busy with themselves.
Yeah.
But IT has a business reason for existence, and it must be driven by business. So from that perspective, what I see is, when I come back to the tool landscape that you mentioned a little bit earlier before, when things became less paper-based and more computer-based, well, there are different vendors that do things differently, right? And we will talk about in another episode how to select your right architecture tool. But you can see vendors where you still see that split, and they sing the song of BPA versus EA, while other vendors have more that approach where they say, yep, our tool covers different use cases. One use case might be to manage applications. Another use case might be to manage processes, but it's all the same. And I think that is the right approach going forward, And even though I mentioned TOGAF before, and I've worked when I was with KPMG 6 years, the global representative of the firm in the Architecture Forum, which is the standards body.
Ooh, all right. That's exciting.
No, it sounds more interesting than it is. I was the person who for $20K a year was allowed to press the button when a voting came up.
Oh, wow.
But anyways, so when you look at it, you can see in the standard, they're still struggling with their IT legacy. So they say, yeah, we want to have business architecture in there. But in our reality, I think they still don't know how to do this and how to put this in the standard. So there's room for improvement, which is good.
Well, on that note, we're going to take a brief break. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about how to put this into practice. In the meantime, we'd like each of you to think about something important here. We've talked a little bit about business process and we've talked a little bit about enterprise architecture. I want you to start thinking about some of the initiatives you've got on your organization and write them down, put it on a piece of paper with 2 columns. One is, what do you think this fits more into business process? Or the other column, do you think this fits more into enterprise architecture? And then in a few seconds, we'll tell you why you're probably right and you're also probably wrong.
Glad that we're all back, and I hope you did the exercise in your mind. Hopefully you didn't do this while driving in your car when listening to this podcast. That would be bad, and we don't appreciate this. Yeah, I hope you're back, and we will see how things come together. Is it really 2 different things, BPM and EA, or is it the same thing, So JM, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, so let's talk about what I see a lot of organizations start when they talk about business process improvement. Where do they start from? Because, as you might imagine, in my role as a transformation lead, I often deal with people who are doing transformation, and that spans a lot of different things. But the group that comes to talk to me is either one coming from the perspective of BPA or coming from the perspective of EA, and they're really hard and fast in what they think themselves as. And so when they think about engaging in process improvement, here's where they start the conversation. They say, we want to capture our business processes. What does that mean to us? It means we need to understand what people are doing. We need to understand what order they do it in. And we need to understand why they do it. So what are they trying to create for the organization? Either that's capabilities, we're talking about directly into products and services that this particular thing creates. We talk about stakeholders. Is this an internal facing process, or are we actually interfacing with customers? And they're literally trying to write that down on the page. And this practice of BPA often takes a look like a whiteboarding session, or people putting big stickies on the wall and trying to create these processes, either individual process models or like an end-to-end flow where we understand the crossover and handoff between different parts of the business. And so in doing that, they're essentially setting themselves up as hard and fast. What I care about is the process, the flow of activities. Now, what they essentially want to do is analyze and identify where they can focus on, where to improve. But first, they want to get a handle on what they've got today. You always say, if you got a GPS, you can never use a GPS unless you know where you are right now, because you need both a destination and you need an origin. And as is discovery and facilitated sessions is going to give you that origin point, and your business drivers and the strategic value of this analysis is going to give you that destination point. And how you get there is what they think of as their business process excellence practice, the management and improvement of those processes. And they're going to create a set of documents and requirements that come out of this exercise so that they can communicate that with this nebulous other groups of people who are going to make it happen. And Roland, I don't know, how successful do you guess those people are in their efforts?
It's fun because it's not only that one group, but obviously the same thing exists on the other side, right? Mm-hmm. So when you look at IT people, I always joke, people go into IT because they don't want to deal with people. They'd rather deal with computers, right? So they're happy in their little ecosystem, right? And doing their little thing. And I found it really interesting when you see IT departments who have business analysts, because it seems that the geeks can't talk to regular folks and they need somebody to translate it instead of just talking with them directly.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of trenches that had been built over the last, 20, 30 years in there. Obviously driven by who has more money.
Yes.
And I think the pendulum just swings, and for a couple of years it just swung to the business side, where you then see things like, oh, I have that tool available and I just need a credit card. So I just buy it for my department. And then IT is freaking out because you have shadow IT and whatnot. I think it's a communication problem that is there. What makes me happy is to see that on a discipline and on a thinking level, people move into the direction to say, it's all the same. It's two sides of the very same coin, right? So that when you look, for example, and I don't want to quote it till death, but when you look, for example, at the architecture development method in TOGAF, the big yellow wagon wheel that you see prominently in all TOGAF slides, well, guess what? They come up with different phases of that method, and one of them is to do architecture descriptions. And they say, you need to think about your strategy, or vision as they call it. You need to talk about your business architecture. That includes processes and organizations and risks and all that type of stuff. And then you need to derive or talk about applications and data. And then at the end you talk about technology, the cables and boxes, or puffy clouds, how you make things happen, right? So I think this is a good thing, right? That people start talking to each other. And I wish I could see the architecture discipline move towards that direction. And I chose my words wisely. So I don't see, hopefully in the future, there is no split between BPM and EA. I think it's all about architecture. Architectures as building of structures, as designing and defining how a future state moves on, right? And I've seen that to bring that in a previous life, where there is a need that you bring together in an organization the strategy group, right? The people who figure out what to do, and you bring in together the architecture group, the people who figure out how do we do this on all those different levels, strategy, business, technology, and so on. And you bring in the PMO, the people who actually should do the work, right? So in a perfect world, you had a one-stop shop organization who does this.
That's a really good goal for the people who do it. What do you think about using a bridge of capabilities? Because I hear that word thrown around a lot. I feel like business capabilities, IT capabilities, they're all really just organizational capabilities. What do you think about using that as the bridge to help translate the way in which each team actually operates into a collective, harmonized organizational operating model?
Yeah, I like that concept a lot, because at the end of the day, what you see is you, in some form or fashion, need to manifest your strategy. Right, that could be strategy diagrams, that could be objective trees, KPI trees, whatever you choose as a visualization, as a means, right? But then the question ultimately comes up when, as part of the strategy, you say, hey, what do I want to sell to my customers, right? Because that's the most important thing there. The question is, what do I have to do? So one is the demand side, the other one is the supply side. What do I have to do to be able to deliver what I want to sell to my customer? And for that, you typically see capabilities as the thing, even though it's an abstraction.
It is, but it's a helpful dovetailing, right? So it's between what people do.
When you look at what a capability is comprised of, right, you see all the usual suspects. You see your customer journeys, what is the path that my customer goes through? You see the internal processes. What do we have to do to deliver this thing? Mm-hmm. You see the applications, you see the data, you see locations, you see organizations, all those different things, skills, whatever comes in, that defines the capability. And in a nutshell, the capability is attached to the strategy.
Yeah.
So if you would come to me as the capability architect or the person sitting on a big pot of gold, and you would ask me, hey, Roland, can I get the amount of X for my project? I would ask you 3 simple questions.
What would you ask me?
Which capability do you create? Mm-hmm. Which capability do you update? Mm-hmm. And which capability do you decommission? And if the answer of that is none of it, well, then my answer would be, sorry, JM, you don't get a single dime, because it's not aligned to the strategy.
Yeah.
So by having that capability architecture or that construct of capability as a bridge between your strategy and the actual execution, I think that's a good way to align things. And based on that, you then see the quote unquote old disciplines of BPM and EA and whatnot fall in line because they play a role in making the capability happen.
That makes a lot of sense. And bringing those two together unites these divided sets of the house. I mean, I feel like that setting these barriers in place only makes your organization weaker. It makes it have to have these handoffs, these conceptual barriers. They talk about this in the field of medicine a lot, this continuity of care for a patient. While an organizational transformational initiative, that continuity of care gets lost if you're passing it back and forth between all these people handing off. But if you bring people together, as you've been talking about through that lens, and as a collective team, then you've got that continuity from all the players being able to collaborate, being able to improve, and ultimately being able to make good decisions on it.
I agree.
And hopefully everyone out there in the audience is thinking about the capabilities in their organization. So now you've got, if you did the previous exercise, and maybe you weren't writing it down as you were driving, and you thought about splitting these into different houses, well, now let's take a look at those as collective things. Now let's take a look at what parts of each of these elements you've written down or you've thought about is handled by these different teams. And what if you brought them together? Let's say they were the same thing. What aspects of these capabilities would need to be addressed or influenced by the opinions and expertise of that quote unquote sides of the house? And what if you could bring them together in a single room and have this conversation? So look at those topics again and think about the composition of them, what makes them up, and how are you going to address some of the workload or thought leadership that will make them successful. We'll leave you for a couple of minutes as you think about that, and then come back with our thoughts and conclusions. And we're back. Thanks so much, folks, for getting that thought exercise done. Hopefully you've seen how really those capabilities are made up of some combination of different teams' inputs and needs, and also thinking of everyone internally and externally as a customer you're helping to guide along their journey and give them what they need to be able to do their business better. But Roland, what does this all come down to? What does this mean for organizations, and why do you want to engage in it? What risks, what benefits are we seeing from putting these disciplines together and really getting a comprehensive view of capabilities for an organization?
Yeah, I think that the biggest challenge that I see today is it's the whole topic around capabilities is relatively new. Right. I know that IT folks try to do this when they try to find redundancies in systems and whatnot, but that was more like IT functionality when they spoke about capabilities and less about business capabilities. And I've seen a lot of business people who don't get their arms around capabilities or business capabilities in general. So I think the biggest risk that I see is that good idea of having business capabilities driving things and using business capabilities and then business capability configurations underneath. So think about gold, silver, bronze implementation. Using them for project planning, because you work for different organizational groups that have different needs. So for example, I worked on an internal project where we tried to reinvent one of our organization's offerings. And in the US, we had like 3,500 practitioners in that offering field, while in the Netherlands, we had 35 or 50. Obviously, the needs for capability configuration in the Netherlands was different than the need for the group in the United States, right? So I think that the danger is if you don't implement it in the first place, and the second thing, you find agreement on what the business capabilities are, and then use the capability configurations as a planning thing, that you're going to miss out, right? So that on the flip side, you would still have those disciplines that we know for 30 years now. You know, you have the business folks doing stuff and you have the IT folks doing stuff, and they don't talk to each other. And then there's a bunch of consultants who make a living of making business and IT talk to each other, which obviously works and is a business model. I don't want to belittle this, you know, so you can make a money of it. But I think you don't do yourself a favor as an organization if you do not implement the capability approach.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a lot of risk of translation error as well. You know, how many times have you seen a requirements document that comes out of IT or business sort of thrown over the wall, and the other side reads it and goes, I don't know, guess I'm going to try my best.
Yeah.
And then what gets designed does not get implemented, and what gets implemented does not get executed. And so there's that the whole miss of requirements translation, and there's a whole miss of learning and development translation that just doesn't end up in people executing the processes the way you've designed it and creating the capabilities you strategized.
I agree. And you answered your own question, so I just can chime in on top of it. I agree with that. You know, I've seen business groups struggle with coming up with requirements because they just haven't worked in system implementation. So whenever it came up from to none functional requirements, they were completely lost, you know, because they might have heard like, oh yeah, we need to have a 99.x% uptime and whatnot, but actually they didn't know what they were talking about. While on the other side, on the functional requirement side, they were looking for window shopping. Oh yeah, let's have a look what the tools do. You know, if I want to implement a new risk system or CRM system or whatnot, let's do some window shopping. What they didn't do is, and where they missed the boat, was obviously the alignment to the strategy.
Yeah.
Right? Because they thought, oh, I can pick this from this tool and this from this tool and this from this tool, which obviously then at the end of the day gives a Frankenstein application that was built and nobody loves. And obviously you don't call your baby ugly, but that's basically what happens, right?
Yeah.
I think the biggest challenge what you see now is, especially when people are getting older, and I talk out of experience, when people are getting older, at some point in time, that's the end of the career there, right? So people and knowledge walk out of the door.
They do all the time. Oh my goodness.
And we see that in government a lot right now, currently, which is obviously an issue, right? So it's definitely a good idea to have things being brought to virtual paper, to have this in a database, and we'll talk about the tools in a next episode, to bring it into a repository where you then can have a look at it and your organization still retains that knowledge.
Yeah, of course.
Same thing is when we think about having something like an enterprise baseline, you know, where you have your what runs being defined and documented, that obviously accelerates the next project.
Yeah.
Because they don't have to start greenfield and try to find the right people and bring them in a room and let them sit through workshops and whatnot, you know. That's one thing that helps. Or you look at, like I said before, you work on the wrong initiatives.
Yeah.
Right? Because something is somebody's baby, you know, and they definitely want to have this thing being implemented. Or whatever, a ton of different things. You know, people are confused. They don't know why this happens before the other one, right? Therefore, they check out and they disengage because they don't understand what's expected from them, right? And these are all things that I see when organizations don't have a clear picture of the path going forward, right? They don't know what they need to put in place to deliver the promise that they developed to their customers.
Yeah.
And then a lot of things come back and say, yeah, IT is crappy, or whatever. That other group didn't deliver, and they're looking for excuses.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, what you can avoid if you have that clear picture to say, yep, this is where we're going. This is what the value is, the product and service that we deliver to our customers. And these are the capabilities that we need to stand up internally to be able to deliver towards that promise.
This is the process and capability capital of your organization that you're developing. You want to maintain it. Otherwise, it's going to walk out the door. You're not going to be able to extract the value you want from it. And I have a brief story about this. I mean, obviously, Roland, you and I have worked in a bunch of different contexts, but I work with a pretty major retailer. And when I first approached the organization, when they first approached me, it was all about IT driven. They came into the IT group that says, listen, everyone's screaming about what they want. We can never support all these things. We've got a billion different technologies. Our architecture review board is overwhelmed because there's a ton of people who want to just credit card purchase all this stuff, and we want to get a handle on it. So the way that they approach it, they said, we just need the IT team to get a better set of requirements from the business. So to do that, we want to understand the business's processes so we can better satisfy them. Well, it's not a terrible thing. It's obviously one side centric. It's the IT people saying we're just going to satisfy business processes by building a bunch of application capabilities. But what it actually ended up happening is that they ended up reaching out to all these different lines of business who had totally wildly different ways of conceptualizing business processes, documenting business processes, understanding what even happened next and how it was done in their process modeling, or even in their operations. And what they found is that not only were their requirements incredibly similar, but they were also failing in very similar ways. A perfect example is they had a perishable food process where they were transporting perishable goods to particular stores, and they were finding that these goods were oftentimes not being properly tracked along the way and arriving perished as a result of the supply chain not being aligned with the IT systems that were tracking time, with being aligned with the business processes that had requirements on it from governmental organizations on the tracking of perishable foods. Mm-hmm. And so they ended up saying, okay, well, listen, actually, a lot of you are doing the same thing. Why don't we establish a standard business process group to actually go out to other lines of business and take these lessons learned and pass on that to those people and become business partner for this line of business that comes from a centralized group of people who have knowledge and understanding of modeling methodologies and expertise and helping to translate into capabilities and helping to disseminate that information across the organization. And what ended up happening is they ended up getting a tight but powerful team of really business partners that interacted with different lines of business and their needs, that interacted with the application architects that were building the systems that were automating their processes, but ultimately acted as this translation, this connective tissue. And it took a couple of years to establish and get this practice moving across the whole organization. But by the time we really had this stood up and we had this working with everyone, they were starting to do data-driven analysis and cross-analysis between different lines of business and between different stakeholders. And so they could say, well, this particular part of this other line of business that's handing it off is causing our system to have struggles, our process not to meet our KPIs. And they were able to see everything put together through that lens of collective capability, through this lens of end-to-end view, including all of their different stakeholders and partners. And that led to faster application development. It led to better automation and more targeted automation. It led to fewer projects being, failing as a result of not having the information they needed or the context behind why they were doing what they were doing. And ultimately, the organization was able to greatly improve their operational efficiency and bottom line, which was really good to watch this sort of evolve. But that came from an understanding of what was important, which is the capabilities, understanding of who was playing, the stakeholders, and their particular needs. And they had a centralized system for collecting information to retain that knowledge, analyze that, and ultimately disseminate it to all their stakeholders. And that success was a huge success for them. And watching that happen, really, it gives you a warm and fuzzy feeling to see people's lives get better as a result of regimented practice.
I like that. Even though one could make the case, this is, even though it's good, I really love the story, right? But that could be also just an intermediate step.
Yeah.
Right. So one project, and that was unfortunately the only project that I worked on, which was large scale on this, was way back when I was working with the German Armed Forces, of all organizations, the military. And they went a step further. They even had their own employees doing all the design work. You see typically in organizations, oh yeah, I don't want to do this. I just hire a consultant because I have money for it. And then you have some poor kid getting thrown into the lion's den and try to figure out stuff out of people not knowing what he talks about. They went even a step further and they said, you know what? Hey, we want to implement that organization-wide software family package, Hey, my dear agencies, you don't have anyone doing this, but you do it. What a weird concept, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think this is a skill that they developed that should be developed in all organizations, right? So imagine you work in a bank, and your bank tries to implement something new. Why should you say, I don't have the knowledge of this? I'm a banker. I don't know how IT works. I don't know what you want from me. I think that's the wrong approach. I think you as a person should see this as an opportunity to grow and develop those skills, right? And this is then all the activities that we spoke about, being able to articulate a good process and bring it to the virtual paper, understanding how processes and capabilities tie together with all the other activities in capabilities, and so on and so forth. So get away from the silos and gain that personal skill that you need to bring up as a key skill, I think, in the 21st century going forward.
I agree. Well, hopefully, folks, this has given you a taste of what we think about business process management, business process analysis, enterprise architecture, two sides of the same coin.
So think about, for the next couple of seconds, which capabilities do you need in your part of the organizations? Right? How are those capabilities aligned to your strategy and to your implementation project? And think about which skills your group needs to build. Right? And if you come back, and hopefully not while driving, you come up with a list of those capabilities, you might be able to bring that in the next conversations that you have in your organization. So let's take a little break, and then we come back and see what you came up with. All right, welcome back, folks. We're getting to a close in our episode, so thank you very much for listening to this episode 2 of the What's Your Baseline podcast. We spoke about the history of the disciplines. We spoke about that EA and BPM are basically two sides of the same coin. And we spoke about that capabilities might be the construct that you're looking forward to align your strategy with your architecture, with your project execution to bring your organization forward. And lastly, we spoke about risk and benefits and had that wonderful example that JM gave us. Thanks again that you listened to the episode 2. Please reach out to us either via email or via a voice message. And I will put a link into our show notes so that you just can go to that website and click on the little message button. And we're happy to bring you in and speak about the question that you have in one of our next shows. Also, please leave a rating about this show or a review of our show in the podcatcher of choice. We're eager to learn from you and obviously improve our podcasting. And last but not least, you will find the show notes of this episode at whatsyourbaseline.com/episode 2. So whatsyourbaseline.com/episode 2. And I'm looking forward to your comments and your suggestions how we improve our podcast. So with that, JM, thanks for joining me on this journey today.
Well, thank you, Roland, and thank you to everyone for joining us on this journey. We're here together.
Have a great day, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again in our next episode.